6.9 feet. That's what the dock marker said on a Monday in December. The week before, 7.5. The week before that, 8.3. The HOA had installed that marker themselves, their own post, their own measurements, watching their own lake disappear. They'd spent $340,000 on a floating restaurant platform, commercial kitchen, 60 covers, string lights on the water. The board president gave a speech about stewardship for the next 16 years. They never checked who owned the water. I did. My family did. In September 1968, before my father drove the first fence post on this land. State Water Permit, WR-1968-041. Priority date, September 12, 1968. Senior to every water right in this county by 19 years. When they put up signs calling it their lake, I called my attorney. When they rejected the demand letter 4-1, I walked to the valve. 22 rotations, full open to full closed. The lake had 8 days left. They called on day 6. But before we start, let me know where you're watching from now. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories like that. The water on Emmett Voss's property had been moving in the same direction for a very long time. It came down from the North Ridge in 2 streams, the East Fork running along the base of the ridge's limestone shelf, the West Fork cutting through the meadow drainage that his grandfather had cleared in 1951 for pasture, and it met at the low point of the property's eastern third, where the land flattened into a broad, natural basin that his father had recognized immediately when the family acquired the parcel in 1968. His father had not been a hydrologist or an engineer. He had been a rancher who understood water the way ranchers understood water, as the difference between a working property and a dry one, as the thing you held on to before you held on to anything else, as the resource whose legal documentation you completed before you drove the first fence post. The family had filed State Water Permit WR-1968-041 with the State Water Resources Board in September 1968, 2 months after closing on the 640-acre parcel, before the first head of cattle moved through the gate, before the first season's hay was cut. The permit covered all beneficial use of the 2 tributary streams and the reservoir basin they fed, stock watering, irrigation, domestic use, and any future agricultural or commercial purpose arising from the parcel's development. The appropriation priority date was September 12, 1968. In water law, the priority date was everything. It was the number that determined whose right held when the water ran low, the number that established seniority in the appropriation system, the number that made one water right senior and every subsequent right in the watershed junior to it. The county's residential development era had not begun until 1987, 19 years after WR-1968-041's priority date. Every water right established in connection with every residential development in the county was junior to Emmett's family permit by at least 19 years. His father had built the outlet structure in 1971, a concrete head wall and riprap apron at the reservoir basin's eastern end, a 36-inch corrugated metal outlet pipe through the earthen berm his father had shaped by hand with a rented scraper, a manually operated gate at the outlet that controlled the reservoir's discharge to the downstream drainage channel. The construction had taken 3 months. His father had done the earthwork himself, hired a 2-man concrete crew for the head wall, and had driven to the county extension office to review the soil mechanics documentation before committing to the berm's geometry. The outlet structure had held for 53 years. Emmett had replaced the outlet pipe in 2019, the original corrugated metal showing the surface oxidation that indicated the end of its service life, and had repointed the head wall's concrete in 2021. But the berm geometry, the apron, and the gate assembly were original construction, his father's work, still performing in 2026 in the same basin where the East Fork and the West Fork had been meeting since before the family owned the land. Emmett had understood the reservoir's hydrology at an engineering level that his father had understood at a practical one. He had studied civil engineering at the State University, class of 1977, 4 years of hydraulics, hydrology, soil mechanics, and structural systems, and had spent the following 34 years as a water systems engineer for a regional civil engineering firm whose practice covered municipal reservoir design, agricultural irrigation infrastructure, and watershed management. He had designed 11 municipal reservoir systems in 4 states. He had testified as an expert witness in 9 water rights disputes. He had written the hydraulic capacity specifications for 2 state-managed irrigation districts. He had retired in 2011 at 66, returned to the family ranch full-time, and had brought with him 34 years of professional documentation habits: the field notebooks, the maintenance logs, the engineering calculation records, the permit filing indices, that he applied to the ranch's water infrastructure with the same systematic completeness he had applied to every professional project. The maintenance log for the ranch's water systems had been running continuously since 1978, the year Emmett had taken over the ranch's operational management from his father. It was a series of hardbound field notebooks, the current volume a replacement of the 12th, each entry dated, each entry covering the specific infrastructure component inspected or maintained, each entry recording the observation and the action in the same format: date, structure, condition, work performed, materials used, next inspection date. 58 years of entries. The log recorded the reservoir's water surface elevation at every inspection, a staff gauge his father had installed on the outlet structure's downstream face in 1973, calibrated to mean sea level. The reading's a continuous record of the reservoir's volumetric history, through 50 years of wet years and dry years, through the 1988 drought that had dropped the surface elevation 14 feet, and the 2011 wet cycle that had held it within 6 inches of the spillway for 47 consecutive days. The reservoir's surface area at normal operating pool was 22 acres. At maximum pool, it reached 24.3 acres, the water spreading into the lower meadow margins, where the East Forks channel widened. At minimum operating pool, the level Emmett maintained during drought conditions, to preserve the senior appropriation's beneficial use, it held at 18.6 acres, the water surface pulling back from the reservoir's eastern and southern margins, the exposed mudflat margins drying to a pale, cracked clay that the water recovered in the first good rain. The reservoir's maximum depth at normal operating pool was 31 feet at the outlet structure's upstream face. The average depth across the 22-acre surface was 14.2 feet, a figure Emmett had calculated from his own bathymetric survey conducted in 1998 using a depth sounder he had borrowed from the county extension office and a GPS unit he had owned since 1996. The survey had taken 2 days from a rowboat. The bathymetric map was in the water systems file in his office, hand-drawn, the depth contours in pencil, the survey date and methodology in the margin notes. The Harborview Estates development had broken ground in April 2008. He had watched the grading from his property's eastern boundary. The developer, a regional residential builder named Castellan Development Group, had acquired the 280-acre parcel immediately east of Emmett's boundary in 2006 and had spent 2 years in the county's entitlement process before the grading crews arrived. The development plan called for 180 residential units, arranged around a series of internal roads and a central amenity corridor, with a community lake feature at the development's western edge, a graded lake basin that the development's marketing materials described as Harborview's defining natural amenity, a community gathering point, a water feature that would set the development apart from comparable residential products in the county. The marketing materials had been distributed before the grading was complete. Emmett had read them. He had noted the word natural applied to a lake basin that was being constructed by a grading crew 50 yards from his property boundary, and had understood exactly what the developer intended. The community lake would be fed by the drainage connection to his reservoir, the hydraulic gradient between Emmett's operating pool and the developer's lower basin making the flow passive and continuous without any pumping requirement. The developer would get a filled lake. Emmett's reservoir would do the work. The developer had not called Emmett. The developer had not filed for a water right. The developer had not applied for an easement. He had found the drainage easement recording in 2010. He had been conducting his annual title review, a practice he had started in 1985, after a neighboring property had recorded a boundary monument inconsistency that had taken 3 years to correct, when he had found the instrument in the county deed records. A drainage easement, recorded on his parcel in November 2008, grant Castellan Development Group and its successors the right to maintain a 24-inch drainage pipe through the eastern boundary of Emmett's parcel, for the purpose of conveying water to the Harborview Estates community lake. The instrument had been signed by Castellan Development Group's title officer and recorded by the county recorder's office. It had not been signed by Emmett Voss. It had not been signed by any member of the Voss family. It had not been accompanied by a deed of easement executed by the parcel's record owner. The county recorder's office had accepted it for recording, a clerical function that did not include verification of the grantor's signature or authority, and it had sat in the deed records for 2 years before Emmett found it. He had called his attorney in 2010, a property and water law practitioner named Gerald Marsh, who had handled the family's ranch matters for 20 years. Gerald had reviewed the instrument and had given Emmett his assessment over the phone in 3 sentences. The easement was defectively recorded. It lacked the grantor's signature. It was unenforceable against Emmett as the record owner, and it could be voided by quiet title action at any time of Emmett's choosing. Then he had said, "You could file now, or you could wait. The pipe is already in. The water is already flowing. Filing now gets you a court order, but it also gets you a construction dispute with a developer who may have already conveyed the community lake to a homeowners association and may not be the right party to litigate against." Emmett had said, "I'll wait." Gerald had said, "Document everything from here forward." Emmett had said, "I always do." He had installed the inlet valve in March 2011. The pipe's inlet was on his side of the boundary, the 24-inch corrugated metal pipe entering his parcel through the eastern boundary berm, its inlet unprotected, the flow passing directly from his reservoir's lower basin into the pipe and east toward the community lake without any control mechanism. Emmett had installed a manually operated gate valve on the pipe's inlet, a 24-inch cast-iron sluice gate, the same specification he had used on municipal reservoir outlet structures throughout his career, rated for the hydraulic head generated by his reservoir's normal operating pool. The installation had taken a weekend. He had set the valve frame in a concrete collar around the pipe inlet, bolted the gate assembly to the frame, and had turned the hand wheel to confirm full open and full closed positions. He had recorded the installation in his maintenance log on March 14, 2011. 24-inch sluice gate valve installed on eastern boundary drainage pipe inlet. Valve position, open. Inlet pipe hydraulic capacity at normal pool head, approximately 180,000 gallons per day. Installation materials, cast iron gate valve, concrete collar, stainless hardware. Next inspection, 90 days. He had written the hydraulic capacity calculation in the margin of the entry, the pipe diameter, the head pressure, the flow coefficient, the calculated discharge rate in gallons per day, in the same format he had used for 34 years of professional engineering calculations. The valve had been open since March 2011. Emmett had inspected it at 90-day intervals, confirmed the gate's operation, and recorded each inspection in the maintenance log. In 13 years of inspections, the valve had never malfunctioned, the concrete collar had shown no movement, and the hydraulic capacity calculation had not changed. He had confirmed the actual flow rate once, in 2016, using a portable flow meter borrowed from his former employer during a visit, and had found the actual discharge at 174,000 gallons per day at normal pool, within 4% of his 2011 calculation. He had recorded the measured figure in the maintenance log beside the original calculation. Measured flow rate 2016, 174,000 gallons per day. Calculated 2011, 180,000 gallons per day. Variance 3.3%. Valve and pipe condition, good. He had watched Harborview Estates fill its community lake, maintain its shoreline, build its dock, plant its perimeter landscaping, and hold its summer events on the water for 14 years. He had watched from his property boundary, from the reservoir's outlet structure, from the meadow path that ran along the eastern berm. He had said nothing because nothing had yet required saying. The water moved east through the pipe because the valve was open, and because the hydraulic gradient moved it. His senior water permit covered the reservoir's beneficial use. The defective easement was in the county deed records where it had always been, unenforceable, waiting. Gerald Marsh had retired in 2017. Emmett had retained Clara Venn, a water rights and property attorney, 32 years of practice, whose name Gerald had given him before retiring, as the only attorney in the region he trusted to handle a senior water appropriation dispute when it came. He had briefed Clara in 2018. WR-1968-041, the defective easement, the valve, the maintenance log, the 14 years of documented water flow. She had reviewed the file and it said, "When you're ready, this is a clean case." He had said, "I'll know when I'm ready." The floating restaurant had opened on a Saturday evening in October. He had not been invited. He was not a Harborview Estates resident, not a member of the HOA, not on the community's mailing list. He had learned about the opening from the county's public notices, which had included the HOA's application for a food service permit for a floating platform structure at the Harborview Estates community lake. He had read the permit application at the county clerk's window, noted the platform's dimensions, 2,400 square feet, pontoon-supported, permanent anchor system, and had driven to his eastern boundary that evening to see the lights. The string lights had been visible from his berm. The platform was anchored in the lake's center. He could see the pontoon structures at waterline, the kitchen exhaust stack, the event tent configuration on the platform's deck. There were perhaps 150 people on the platform and on the dock. The lake's surface was at its normal operating level, the water dark and still around the platform's anchor lines, the pontoons riding well above the lake's bottom. He had stood at the berm for 20 minutes, watching the lights reflected in the water, and had counted the pontoon structures against the dock's depth marker the HOA had installed on the dock's outboard piling. Marker post, 9 feet visible above the water line, the HOA's own measurement instrument standing in the water of his own reservoir's outflow. He had taken 3 photographs with his phone, time-stamped, geotagged to his parcel boundary. He had walked back to the house and had called Clara from the kitchen. It was 9:15 p.m. She had answered on the second ring. He had said, "They open the restaurant tonight." She had said, "I saw the permit notice. How does it look?" He had said, $340,000 of investment, minimum, on the platform and the fit-out. The pontoons require at least 6 feet of water depth to operate without grounding. The lake is at 9 feet right now." She had said, "What are you thinking?" He had said, "I'm thinking 14 years is long enough. The valve is documented. The permit is valid. The easement is defective. The HOA just spent $340,000 on a structure that requires my water to float." She had said, "I'll have a demand letter ready by end of next week." He had said, "Take your time and do it right." She had said, "Emmett, I need to ask you something before we start. If this goes to enforcement, if you close the valve, the lake drops. The restaurant grounds. The HOA's entire investment is on the bottom. Are you prepared for that?" He had said, "I installed the valve in 2011. I have the maintenance log, the permit, the hydraulic calculation, and the defective easement instrument. I have been prepared for that since 2011. She had said, "All right, I'll have the demand letter to you by next Friday." He had hung up and had gone to the desk in the corner of the kitchen where the current maintenance log volume sat beside the phone. He had opened it to the current page and had written the evening's entry. October 14th, 2025. Reservoir, normal pool, 9.0 feet depth at dock marker per visual observation from East Berm. Harborview Floating Restaurant, open this date. Platform pontoon structure visible, approximately 2,400 square feet, permanent anchor. Lake surface elevation adequate for platform operation. Valve position, open. Note, demand letter to be prepared by Clara Venn. WR-1968-041, enforcement and quiet title action to proceed. He had initialed the entry and closed the log. He had looked at the water permit in the file cabinet beside the desk. The original 1968 filing, the permit certificate in the state standard format, the appropriation priority date in the upper right corner where the state always put it, September 12th, 1968. The number that made every downstream water assumption in the county junior to this one. The number his father had understood the importance of before driving the first fence post. He held the permit for a moment in the kitchen light, the paper dry and intact, the filing date 57 years behind him and the enforcement action ahead of him, and set it back in the file. The water had been moving in the same direction for a very long time. It would keep moving until he decided it should stop. The platform had arrived on a flatbed in 3 sections on a Tuesday morning in late July. Emmett had been at his eastern berm when the truck pulled through the Harborview Estates construction gate. He had seen the flatbeds load from the meadow path, the 3 pontoon platform sections strapped to the deck, each section approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, the aluminum pontoon tubes visible beneath the platform framing, the deck surface a composite material that reflected the morning sun in a broad, flat plane. He had stood at the berm and watched the flatbed maneuver through the development's western access road toward the community lake, moving slowly on the internal road, whose pavement had not been designed for the flatbed's gross vehicle weight. The truck had taken 22 minutes to cover the quarter-mile from the construction gate to the lake's northern staging area. Emmett had timed it on his watch. He had his field notebook with him, a smaller spiral notebook he carried on property walks, separate from the bound maintenance log he kept at the desk, used for site observations that he would transfer to the maintenance log later. He had written, July 22nd, 2025. Platform delivery observed from East Berm. 3 sections, flatbed transport, aluminum pontoon tube construction. Estimated 40 by 20 feet per section. Platform deck, composite material. Delivery time, approximately 9:14 a.m. Internal road, showing stress marks at delivery truck turning radius. He had noted the truck's DOT number from the cab door, the platform manufacturer's name from the section labeling he could read with his field binoculars, a commercial pontoon platform fabricator based in the next state, a company whose product line he had looked up the week after the food service permit application had appeared in the county notices. The assembly had taken 4 days. A marine contractor's crew had brought the 3 sections together on the lake's surface, using a small crane mounted on a work barge, the sections joined at their connection flanges, the completed platform measuring approximately 120 feet by 40 feet at its assembled footprint, 4,800 square feet of platform surface, though the food service permit had listed 2,400 square feet as the kitchen and dining area, the remaining deck space being open circulation, a perimeter rail system, and what the permit application had described as an outdoor event terrace. The anchor system had gone in the day after assembly, 4 concrete deadweight anchors lowered to the lake bottom by the work barge, connected to the platform by stainless chain and nylon line, the anchor geometry placing the platform at the lake's geometric center with approximately 40 feet of water clearance on each side. Emmett had observed the anchor placement from the berm, and had estimated the anchor positions against the lake's shoreline geometry, noting the approximate water depth at the anchor locations based on the chain scope he could see between the platform and the water surface. The kitchen installation had taken 3 weeks. A commercial kitchen contractor's crew, a refrigeration contractor, an electrical contractor running conduit from the lake's northern shore to the platform via an underwater cable run, a gas contractor installing a propane system with shoreside tank storage. Emmett had observed the contractor traffic from his berm at intervals, noting each trade's arrival and departure in his field notebook. He had not been close enough to observe the kitchen's interior, but the contractor vehicle's specializations were legible from their markings. The refrigeration contractor's truck, identifying the type of commercial equipment being installed. The electrical contractor's permit posting visible on the shoreside connection point from his binoculars. The propane tank installation at the northern shore visible clearly. He had cross-referenced the food service permit's kitchen specification, commercial range, hood suppression system, walk-in refrigeration, 3-compartment sink, against the contractor sequence he had observed and had confirmed the installation was proceeding as permitted. The HOA's community forum had been documenting the construction in real time. Emmett was not a member of the forum. It was a residents-only platform requiring a Harborview Estates unit owner registration. But the forum's progress posts had been appearing in the county's general social media environment, shared by residents to their personal accounts, visible to non-residents and non-members who followed those accounts. A neighbor of Emmett's, a rancher named Dale Pritchard, whose property sat north of Emmett's along the ridge, had been sharing the forum posts to his own account since the platform delivery, finding the construction interesting in the way that large-scale projects on adjacent properties were interesting to people who paid attention to the land. Dale had not known about Emmett's water permit or the valve. He had shared the posts because they were about a floating restaurant being built on a lake he could see from his own north meadow, and because he had found the construction impressive. Emmett had read the shared posts on his phone at the kitchen table in the evenings. The forum posts were Diane Hollis's work. Her voice was consistent across them, the language of institutional pride that came naturally to a person who had conceived the project, shepherded it through 2 years of board deliberation and financing arrangement, and was watching it become physical in real time. The first post had appeared the day the platform sections arrived. Today is the day. After 2 years of planning and 6 months of permitting, our floating lakeside restaurant platform has arrived at Harborview Lake. This is the moment your HOA board has been working toward, a signature amenity that will define this community for decades. Watch this space for daily updates. She had posted photographs of the 3 sections on the flatbed, the work barge positioning the first section, the crane lifting the connection hardware. The photographs were well composed, taken from the dock, the lake's surface and the platform's aluminum structure filling the frame. The subsequent posts had followed the construction week by week. The completed platform assembly photographed from the shoreline with the full 120-foot length visible. The kitchen contractor's arrival announced with a photograph of the commercial range being craned onto the platform deck. The electrical connection celebrated with a post noting that the platform was now powered and that the event lighting system had been tested for the first time. And it is beautiful, Harborview. The refrigeration system installation had merited a post describing the walk-in cooler's capacity in terms of the volume of event catering it could support. The propane system's commissioning had been noted, the exterior rail system's installation, the composite decking's finishing, the perimeter string light installation, the dining furniture delivery. Each phase had its post, its photographs, its caption in Diane's voice. The cumulative financial figure had appeared in the post announcing the dining furniture delivery in late September. Today, the dining sets arrived, 60 covers of commercial-grade outdoor furniture, the final piece of our $340,000 investment in this community's most ambitious amenity project. Every dollar of this came from the HOA's Capital Reserve Fund and the special assessment approved by 74% of residents in the March vote. You invested in this. In 3 weeks, you'll sit at these tables on the water and understand exactly what that investment bought. The post had included a photograph of the dining furniture arranged on the platform deck. 60 chairs, 15 four-top tables, the lake visible through the perimeter rail, the string lights overhead. Emmett had read the post at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. He had written the figure in his field notebook, $340,000, capital reserve and special assessment, 74% resident approval, and had underlined it once. Not because the figure surprised him. He had estimated the investment at between $300,000 and $380,000 based on the contractor sequence he had observed, and the platform fabricator's commercial pricing, which was publicly available on the manufacturer's website. The figure confirmed his estimate's accuracy. He had underlined it because it was the number that made the water rights question irreversible. $340,000 of community investment on a platform whose operation was entirely dependent on a water supply that had no legal instrument behind it, whose continued operation required Emmett's inlet valve to remain open, whose physical survival required the lake to maintain a minimum depth that only Emmett's senior water right could guarantee. At $340,000, the HOA had passed the point where the defective easement was an administrative inconvenience. At $340,000, it was a structural exposure, the kind that produced court judgments, not letters of apology. He had called Clara the next morning and had read her the figure. She had said, "That confirms the demand letter's framing. We're not asking them to correct a paperwork error. We're asking them to recognize that their primary amenity investment is sitting on water they don't have a legal right to use." He had said, "Correct." She had said, "I'll have the final demand letter to you by end of week." The opening event had been on a Saturday in mid-October, 3 weeks after the furniture delivery post. The HOA had promoted it as a community-wide event. Every unit in Harborview Estates invited. The evening structured as a combination restaurant opening and community celebration. The forum posts in the week before the opening had been Diane's most sustained documentation of the project's arc. A retrospective post tracing the restaurant's concept from its first appearance in a board meeting agenda 2 years earlier, a post featuring photographs of the construction sequence from platform delivery to furniture installation, a post naming the board members and contractors whose work had made the project possible, a final post the morning of the opening that read, Tonight, Harborview. See you on the water. Emmett had driven to his eastern berm at 7 p.m. He had parked his truck at the meadow gate and had walked the berm path with his field binoculars and his phone. The event was already underway. The platform's string lights were on, the perimeter rail strung with additional lantern lighting that had not been visible in the earlier posts, the dining tables visible through the lights, the platform deck populated with residents moving between the dining area and the outdoor terrace. The dock connecting the platform to the shore was strung with lights as well, the crowd on the dock and on the shore side visible as a continuous social gathering that had spilled from the platform onto the development's lakeside common area. He estimated 150 to 180 people from the crowd density. The platform was fully occupied at its 60-cover dining capacity, with overflow seating on the outdoor terrace and standing circulation throughout. He had focused the binoculars on the dock's depth marker, the HOA's own piling marker, the graduated post installed at the dock's outboard end, whose waterline position indicated the lake's current depth. The marker showed 9 feet of water above the lake bed at the dock's outboard location, consistent with his reservoir's normal operating pool level, and consistent with his own depth observations from the berm over the preceding weeks. The platform's pontoons were riding at their design draft. He could see the pontoon tubes at the waterline, the aluminum hull well above the lake bed, the platform stable on its anchor system in 9 feet of water. He had taken photographs, the platform lights reflected in the lake surface, the pontoon draft at the waterline, the dock marker at 9 feet, the crowd on the platform deck visible through the binoculars. He had time-stamped each photograph and geotagged them to his property boundary. He had noted the photographs in his field notebook. October 14th, 2025. Opening event documented from East Berm. Platform at normal operating draft. Lake depth, 9.0 feet at dock marker. Crowd, estimated 150 to 180. String light installation visible. Outdoor terrace occupied. Photographs, 7 images, time-stamped, geotagged. Diane's speech had not been audible from the berm. 200 yards of open water between his position and the platform, the ambient sound of the event carrying across the lake's surface as an indistinct social noise without intelligible words. He had not needed to hear it. He had read the text of the speech 4 days later when Diane had posted it to the forum in full, which Dale Pritchard had shared to his own account with the caption, "Neighbors Lake Restaurant opened last weekend. Here's the HOA president's speech. Pretty impressive project." The speech was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph established the project's 2-year timeline, the board's unanimous commitment after the initial concept vote, the challenges of the permitting process, and the financing arrangement. The second paragraph named the contractors and the board members who had contributed to the project's execution. The third paragraph addressed the residents who had approved the special assessment. You trusted your board with $340,000 of this community's money. And that trust is why you are sitting at these tables tonight, on this lake, in this light. The fourth paragraph was the one that Emmett had read 3 times. This lake has always been Harborview's defining natural feature. It was here when the development was planned. It was here when the first residents moved in. It has been the backdrop of 16 years of community life in this place. Tonight we are not just opening a restaurant. We are recognizing what this lake has always meant to this community, and committing, as a board and as a community, to its stewardship for the next 16 years and beyond. He had folded his phone and set it on the kitchen table, and had opened the maintenance log to the current page, and had written the entry he had already composed in his field notebook on the berm. October 14th, 2025. Reservoir. Normal pool, 9.0 feet depth at dock marker per visual observation from East Berm. Harborview Floating Restaurant. Open this date. Then he had added what the speech required him to add. Note. HOA President's public statement claims stewardship of Community Lake for future 16 years. Lake water source, this reservoir, via eastern boundary drainage pipe, valve position open. No recorded water supply easement in county deed records. No water right held by HOA. WR-1968-041 Senior Appropriation Priority. September 12, 1968. Demand letter to be issued by Clara Venn. Enforcement action to follow if demand rejected. He had initialed the entry and closed the log. He had looked at the kitchen clock, 9:20 p.m. He had picked up his phone and called Clara. She had answered on the second ring. He had said, "I was at the berm tonight. The opening went well for them." He had described what he had seen: the crowd, the lights, the pontoon draft, the dock marker at 9 feet. She had said, "And the platform is performing as designed." He had said, "Completely. The lake is at normal pool. The pontoons are at designed draft. The anchor system is set." She had said, "Which means the dependency is fully established. The platform's operation requires the lake at operating depth, and the lake's operating depth requires your valve." He had said, "Correct." She had said, "I'll have the demand letter to you Monday morning." He had said, "Clara." The speech said they're committed to the lake's stewardship for the next 16 years. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "Then they'll want a recorded water supply easement." He had said, "They'll want one when they understand they don't have one." She had said, "That's what the demand letter is for." He had hung up and had gone to the kitchen window that faced east toward the berm, the lake's lights not visible from the house. The distance and the intervening meadow and berm absorbed them. But present, he knew, reflected in the water that was there because his valve was open, and his permit was valid, and his family had filed the appropriation in September 1968, before driving the first fence post. He had looked at the window for a moment. Then he had gone to bed. The demand letter would go out Monday. Whatever happened after that would happen in the order that water rights enforcement required: the demand, the response, the filing, the hearing, the judgment. He had been patient for 14 years. He could be patient for whatever the process required. The valve was open. The lake was at 9 feet. The restaurant was open on his water. For now. Clara Venn's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that had housed the county's oldest title abstract company, before the abstract company had been acquired, and the building had been sold, and the offices retained the character of a place where property records had been taken seriously for a long time. Deep filing cabinets along the interior walls, a long wooden table in the conference room whose surface was worn smooth at the chair positions, bookshelves carrying the state's water code, annotated volumes in chronological order from 1987 forward, the current volume flagged with a dozen colored tabs. Clara had practiced water rights and property law for 32 years, not 22. She had corrected the number once when Emmett had cited it, mildly, without elaboration, and he had updated his understanding accordingly. She had been Gerald Marsh's recommendation because Gerald had referred to her as the only attorney in the region who read water permit instruments the way engineers read structural drawings, from the foundation up, not from the conclusion back. She had the full file on her conference table when Emmett arrived Monday morning. WR-1968-041 in the original permit certificate format, the State Water Board's filing index showing the appropriation chain, the beneficial use documentation his family had filed in 1968, and the supplemental beneficial use report Emmett had filed in 1994, updating the permit's recorded uses to include the expanded irrigation system he had installed that year. She had the county deed records for both parcels, Emmett's 640-acre parcel and the Harborview Estates development parcel, pulled from the county recorder's office that morning, the deed index printed and flagged at the drainage easement instrument. She had the drainage easement instrument itself, 2 pages, the legal description of the easement corridor, the pipe specification, the stated purpose, and the signature block. The signature block had 2 lines, one for the grantor, one for the notary. The grantor line was blank. The notary block was completed, notarizing the signature of Castellan Development Group's title officer on the grantee side of the instrument. The grantor's signature, Emmett Voss, record owner of the burden parcel, was absent. Clara had set the instrument in the center of the table when Emmett sat down and had said, "This is the document. 2 pages. The grantor line is blank." A drainage easement is a conveyance. It transfers a property right from the grantor to the grantee. A conveyance requires the grantor's signature. Without the grantor's signature, this instrument conveys nothing. The county recorder accepted it for recording because the recorder's office performs a ministerial function. It records instruments that are presented in the proper format with the recording fee. It does not verify that the grantor has signed or that the grantor has the authority to grant. This instrument went into the deed records in November 2008 with a blank grantor line, and it has been sitting there ever since representing a property right that was never actually conveyed. Emmett had said, "I know. Gerald told me in 2010. Clara had said, I know Gerald told you. I want to walk through the full chain because the demand letter needs to be built on the complete record, not just the easement defect. The easement defect is the headline, but the water permit is the foundation, and the foundation needs to be in the letter in full because the HOA's counsel, whoever they retain, is going to look for the weakest point in our position, and the weakest point is not the easement. The weakest point is an argument that 14 years of continuous water use has established an implied easement or a prescriptive right that survives the defective recording. We need to foreclose that argument in the demand letter before it becomes their defense in the litigation. She had opened the water permit file and had walked him through the appropriation chain from the beginning. State Water Permit, WR-1968-041, had been filed under the state's prior appropriation doctrine, the legal framework governing water rights in the western states, under which the first person to put water to beneficial use acquires a senior right that is protected against all subsequent appropriators in times of shortage. The priority date, September 12, 1968, established Emmett's family as the senior appropriator of the two tributary streams and the reservoir basin they fed. Every water right established in the county after September 12, 1968, was junior to WR-1968-041. Junior rights were subordinate to senior rights. When water was scarce, junior appropriators were cut off before senior appropriators, and the senior appropriator's full permitted volume was protected until the senior right was fully satisfied. The beneficial use documentation filed in 1968 had covered stock watering, irrigation, and domestic use, the three categories of beneficial use the state recognized for agricultural parcels in that period. The 1994 supplemental filing had added expanded irrigation and recreational impoundment, the latter category covering the reservoir's surface area as a permitted recreational use, a category Emmett had added on the advice of a water law specialist he had consulted when the state had updated its beneficial use classifications. The recreational impoundment classification was significant because it established that Emmett's permitted beneficial use included maintaining the reservoir at its operating pool level. Any drawdown of the reservoir that impaired the permitted recreational impoundment use was an interference with a permitted beneficial use, actionable under the state water code. Clara had said, the HOA's position, when they develop one, will be that they are not drawing down your reservoir. They are receiving passive drainage from it through the pipe, drainage that you have voluntarily allowed by keeping the valve open for 14 years. Our response to that position is the permit. The permit covers the reservoir's full volume at operating pool. The drainage through that pipe is your water, water covered by a senior appropriation permit, moving to a downstream use that has no water right of its own. That is not drainage. That is beneficial use of your permitted water by an unpermitted downstream party. 14 years of that use does not establish a right. Prescriptive water rights are not recognized under this state's prior appropriation doctrine. There is no legal mechanism by which 14 years of using someone else's permitted water creates an independent water right in the user. He had said, I knew that, but I wanted to hear you say it. She had said, I know. Now the implied easement argument. The HOA will also argue, or their counsel will argue, that even if the drainage easement instrument is defective, the HOA has an implied easement based on the pre-existing use established during the Castellan development, that the community lake was part of the development's original design, that the drainage connection was openly installed and openly used, and that the HOA, as the successor to the development's common area infrastructure, acquired whatever rights Castellan had in the drainage connection. The problem with that argument is that Castellan had no rights in the drainage connection to convey. Castellan installed the pipe without Emmett's permission, recorded a defective easement instrument without Emmett's signature, and conveyed the community area, including the lake and the drainage infrastructure, to the HOA in 2009 via the development's common area deed. That deed conveyed whatever Castellan held. Castellan held a defective instrument and a trespass. The HOA inherited a defective instrument and a trespass. 14 years does not cure the trespass because Emmett has not been absent or unaware. He discovered the recording in 2010. He documented it, and his continued silence has been a strategic choice, not an abandonment of his rights. We will put that in the demand letter, that Emmett's continued valve operation since 2011 has been voluntary and non-binding and does not constitute a waiver of his rights under WR-1968-041 or his right to enforce the quiet title action. Emmett had said, the maintenance log entry from 2010 establishes the discovery date. Clara had said, it does. And the valve installation log from 2011 establishes that he took a physical action, installing a control mechanism, that is inconsistent with an intent to abandon or waive. A person who intends to waive a right does not install a gate valve on the pipe whose use he is waiving. She had closed the water permit file and had set her notepad on the table. She had said, the demand letter will have 4 components. First, the water permit, WR-1968-041, the priority date, the beneficial use documentation, the statement of what the permit covers and what its seniority means. Second, the drainage easement instrument, the defective recording, the absent grantor's signature, the legal consequence, which is that no easement right was ever conveyed. Third, the unauthorized use, 14 years of the HOA's community lake operating on Emmett's permitted water without a water right, a recorded easement, or a water supply agreement, and the statement that this use has been voluntary and non-binding and does not constitute a waiver. Fourth, the demand, 2 items, a recorded water supply easement negotiated at fair market value, reflecting the 14 years of use and the nature of the right being conveyed, and compensation for the unauthorized beneficial use of Emmett's water right during the 14-year period. Timeline for response, 30 days. Consequence of non-response or rejection. Emmett closes the valve, and we file the water rights enforcement action and quiet title simultaneously. Emmett had said, what's the compensation figure for the 14 years? Clara had said, I've had a water rights economist on retainer for 2 years who specializes in agricultural and recreational water valuation. I want her to run the calculation before I put a number in the letter. The framework is, the HOA has been receiving approximately 174,000 gallons per day of water from Emmett's senior permit for 14 years without compensation. At the state's established beneficial use valuation rates for recreational impoundment water in this region, and accounting for the pump and infrastructure costs the HOA has avoided by receiving the water passively through the drainage pipe rather than sourcing it independently, the 14-year figure is going to be significant. I want the economist number in the letter because a number derived from a credentialed methodology is harder to dismiss than a number I derive from the code. Emmett had said, how long does she need? Clara had said, a week. The demand letter goes out 2 weeks from today. The HOA has 30 days to respond. The demand letter had gone out on a Monday morning, delivered by certified mail to the HOA's registered agent address, and by email to the HOA's management company, whose contact information Clara had obtained from the county's HOA registration records. The letter was 11 pages, the 4 components Clara had outlined at the conference table, the water rights economist's 14-year compensation calculation in a 2-page appendix, the quiet title analysis in a separate appendix, citing the defective instrument's recording number and the specific statutory provisions under which the action would be filed. The economist's figure for the unauthorized beneficial use was $118,000. The 14-year value of 174,000 gallons per day of senior appropriation water at the regional recreational impoundment rate, net of the passive delivery discount that Clara had applied to reflect the reduced infrastructure burden. The demand letter requested $118,000 in compensation for the unauthorized use and a recorded water supply easement negotiated at fair market value within 30 days, or Emmett would close the inlet valve and file simultaneously in the water court and the county district court. Diane had received the letter on a Tuesday. Dale Pritchard had told Emmett this, not because Dale had seen the letter, but because Dale's wife worked at the county library and had mentioned to Dale that Diane Hollis had come into the library's public records terminal on Tuesday afternoon and had spent 90 minutes pulling parcel records and deed index entries, which was not the behavior of someone who had received a routine piece of HOA correspondence. Dale had called Emmett that evening and had said, "Something's going on with your neighbor's HOA." Emmett had said, "I know." Dale had said, "Anything I should know about?" Emmett had said, "Nothing that affects your property." Dale had said, "All right," and had rung off. The HOA had retained counsel within a week of receiving the letter, a property and litigation attorney named Richard Aldis, whose practice was based in the county seat and whose client list included 3 other HOA associations in the region. Clara had confirmed Aldis's retention when his office called to request a 30-day extension of the response deadline, citing the need to conduct title research and consult with a water rights specialist. Clara had granted 15 days, the standard professional accommodation for a legitimate research request, insufficient time to conduct a comprehensive water rights analysis, but sufficient to confirm the basic facts of the permit and the easement instrument. She had noted the extension in Emmett's file and had called Emmett to tell him. He had said, "They're looking at the permit." She had said, "They're looking at everything." They pulled the deed index within 24 hours of receiving the letter. Aldis called the next week. They know what the permit says. What they're trying to determine is whether there's a viable defense. Emmett had said, "Is there one?" She had said, "Not a strong one. The defective easement is a clean title defect. No grantor signature, no conveyance. The prior appropriation doctrine forecloses prescriptive water rights. The implied easement argument is weak because Castellan had nothing to convey. The strongest position they have is a negotiation posture. They come back and say the easement is defective, but the HOA is a good faith successor who acquired the property in reliance on the recorded instrument, and they ask for a negotiated resolution rather than enforcement. That's the position Aldis will recommend if he's competent," he had said, "and if Diane overrides him." Clara had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "Then she overrides him and the board votes to reject the demand, and we close the valve and file the action, and the lake drops 8 inches a week, and the restaurant sits lower and lower until the board figures out that the negotiated resolution they could have had in week 1 is going to cost considerably more in week 8. Aldis's response had arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a 12-page letter on his firm's letterhead, addressed to Clara, copied to Diane Hollis as HOA president. The letter's argument ran in 3 parts. First, the drainage easement instrument, while acknowledging a technical irregularity in its execution, constituted constructive notice of the drainage pipe's existence and the HOA's reliance on it, and the HOA's 14-year good faith use of the community lake infrastructure established an implied easement that was enforceable despite the recording defect. Second, the water flowing from Emmett's property to the community lake through the drainage pipe was properly characterized as natural drainage, to which the lower riparian parcel had a right to receive. And Emmett's senior water permit did not extinguish the riparian right to natural drainage flow. Third, Emmett's 14-year voluntary maintenance of the open valve constituted acquiescence in and ratification of the drainage easement, and his attempt to now enforce the easement defect was barred by laches and equitable estoppel. Clara had called Emmett after reading the letter. She had said, 3 arguments, none of them strong. The implied easement argument fails, because constructive notice of a defective instrument is not the same as a valid conveyance. The HOA knew or should have known the easement was defective if they had conducted basic title due diligence before the $340,000 investment. The riparian drainage argument fails because this state is a prior appropriation state, not a riparian rights state. Riparian doctrine does not apply to water rights here, and the water flowing through that pipe is not natural drainage. It is reservoir outflow from a permitted impoundment. The laches and estoppel argument is their strongest, but it fails because Emmett installed the valve in 2011, a physical act that is inconsistent with ratification, and because his maintenance log documents his continuous reservation of rights since 2010. Laches requires that the plaintiff's delay prejudice the defendant. Emmett's delay did not prejudice the HOA's ability to negotiate a water supply agreement. It did allow them to spend $340,000 on a floating restaurant without one, but that expenditure was made without any title due diligence, and a court is not going to characterize a failure to perform basic title work as prejudice caused by the opposing party. Emmett had said, "So the arguments fail." Clara had said, "In court, yes. The question is whether the board understands that they fail." The board meeting had been on a Tuesday evening. The Harborview Estates HOA board, 5 members, Diane presiding, Aldis present by phone. Clara had not been present. She had learned the meeting's outcome from the certified letter Aldous had sent the following Friday. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The board had reviewed the demand letter, the water rights documentation, and Aldous's legal analysis. The board had concluded that the drainage easement, while acknowledging certain execution irregularities, remained a valid instrument establishing the HOA's right to receive water through the drainage pipe, and that 14 years of established community use further confirmed that right. The board had voted 4-1 to reject the demand. The HOA would not pay the $118,000 compensation figure and would not negotiate a water supply easement under the demand's terms. The board considered the matter resolved and requested that further communications be directed to Aldous's office. Clara had called Emmett the afternoon the letter arrived. She had said, 4-1 rejection. They're going to litigate. He had said, who was the one? She had said, the letter doesn't say. It just says 4-1. He had said, all right, file the action. She had said, I'm filing Monday. Water rights enforcement and quiet title, simultaneously. Water court and district court. And Emmett, before I file, are you ready to close the valve? He had said, I've been ready since 2011. She had said, then close it after I file. Give me the filing date and you close it that afternoon. I want the valve closure to be simultaneous with the action's filing, so the sequence is clear. Demand rejected, action filed. Valve closed in exercise of WR-1968-041 rights. In that order. He had said, Monday afternoon. She had said, Monday afternoon. He had hung up and had gone to his desk and had opened the maintenance log to the current page. He had written the entry for the day, the demand rejection, the 4-1 vote, the filing scheduled for Monday, the valve closure scheduled for Monday afternoon. He had initialed the entry and had looked at the date, a Friday in November, the days short now, the meadow dry in the late autumn light outside the window, the reservoir at normal pool where it had been since September. He had closed the log and set it on the desk. Monday afternoon. Clara filed at 8:50 a.m. on Monday. Emmett knew the exact time because she had texted him from the courthouse. Filed. Water court and district court simultaneous. Cause numbers to follow this afternoon. You're clear. He had been at his kitchen table with his coffee and his phone. The maintenance log open to the current page. The valve closure entry already written in pencil pending the confirmation. Date, time pending, valve position to be recorded, reservoir level from the morning staff gauge reading at 9.2 feet, community lake depth at closure, estimated 9.1 feet based on his most recent berm observation 4 days prior. He had read the text, set the phone on the table, and had picked up his pen and written the time in the entry. 8:50 a.m. Action filed per Clara Venn. Water rights enforcement and quiet title. Water court and district court simultaneous. He had driven to the valve at noon. The valve was at the eastern boundary berm, a 12-minute walk from the house on the meadow path, a 4-minute drive on the ranch track that ran along the berm's southern face. He had driven because he was carrying his field camera, the handheld GPS unit, and the torque wrench he used for the valve's annual inspection, and because he intended to photograph the closure sequence completely, the valve in open position before closure, the handwheel position, the reservoir level at the staff gauge, the valve in closed position after closure, the downstream pipe outlet visible from the berm's eastern face. The photographs would be time-stamped and geotagged. They would go into the water systems file beside the 2011 installation photographs and the 2016 flow measurement record. He had parked at the berm track's end and had walked to the valve assembly. The concrete collar was intact, the gate frame showing the surface weathering of 14 years of outdoor exposure, but no structural movement. The handwheel in the full open position, horizontal, the gate fully retracted, the pipe inlet clear and flowing, the reservoir water moving east through the 24-inch opening at its calculated rate. He had taken the first photograph, the valve in full open position, the handwheel horizontal, the reservoir surface visible in the background, the GPS unit in the frame showing the coordinate reading. He had noted the reservoir's staff gauge, 9.2 feet, consistent with the morning reading, the operating pool stable. He had set the torque wrench on the handwheel and had begun turning. The sluice gate valve closed by clockwise rotation of the handwheel. each full rotation advancing the gate approximately 3/8 of an inch into the pipe opening. The gate's cast iron face moving across the pipe's flow cross-section in the same mechanical sequence it had moved through at every annual inspection for 14 years. Smooth in its guides, the gate packing intact. No leakage past the seals that he had replaced in 2019 as part of the outlet structure maintenance cycle. It took 22 full rotations to bring the gate from full open to full closed. He had counted them at every inspection. The count a verification of the gate's travel and the mechanical condition of the handwheel assembly. He had counted them now, 1 through 22, the gate advancing, the flow through the pipe reducing, the sound of the water moving through the inlet, diminishing rotation by rotation, until at rotation 22, the gate was seated, and the flow had stopped, and the pipe was closed, and the water on the downstream side of the valve was whatever had been in the pipe at closure, moving nowhere. He had taken the second photograph, the valve in full closed position, the handwheel vertical, the gate seated, the GPS unit in the frame, the timestamp reading 12:19 p.m. He had written in his field notebook, November 17th, 2025, 12:19 p.m., valve closed, 22 rotations full open to full close, gate seated, no bypass flow audible, reservoir level at closure, 9.2 feet staff gauge, community lake depth at closure, estimated 9.1 feet per berm observation November 13th, pipe downstream, static, photographs, 6 images, time-stamped, geotagged. He had looked at the pipe's downstream face from the berm's eastern edge, the 24-inch outlet on the berm's east face, the pipe end visible, the flow that had been moving through it for 14 years absent, the pipe opening dark and still. He had driven back to the house and had transferred the field notebook entry to the maintenance log, adding the cause numbers Clara had texted him that afternoon, and had closed the log. He had gone back to the berm the following Monday. The dock marker was visible from his berm observation position with the field binoculars, the HOA's own graduated post at the dock's outboard end, the waterline position indicating the lake's current depth. At closure, the marker had shown 9.1 feet above the lake bed. 1 week after closure, the marker showed 8.3 feet, 8 inches of drop in 7 days, consistent with his evaporation and seepage estimate of 8 inches per week at the lake's surface area and the substrate's permeability characteristics, which he had estimated from the county's soil survey data in 2011 when he had first calculated the drawdown timeline. He had photographed the dock marker from the berm, the marker post, the water line, the platform visible in the background at its anchor position, the pontoons riding at their normal draft, the lake's surface still and unrevealing of the 8 inches it had already lost. He had noted the reading in his field notebook and had transferred it to the maintenance log that evening. November 24th, 2025. Week 1 post-closure. Dock marker, 8.3 feet. Drop from closure, 8 inches. Consistent with evaporation/seepage estimate. Platform draft, normal, no visible change. Photographs, 4 images. The second Monday, the marker was at 7.5 feet, 16 inches of total drop from closure. He had photographed the marker from the berm and had looked at the platform through the binoculars with the specific attention of an engineer who had calculated the pontoon draft against the lake depth from the beginning. The pontoons were still well above the lake bed, the platform riding at what appeared to the casual observer as its normal operating position. But to Emmett's eye, the platform's freeboard had changed. The pontoon tubes were sitting fractionally lower relative to the dock's rail height. The change not dramatic but present, measurable against the dock geometry he had been photographing for 6 weeks. He had noted it in his field notebook. Pontoon freeboard reduced approximately 14 to 16 inches from opening day position. Platform structurally stable. Anchor lines showing slightly reduced catenary, consistent with reduced water depth at anchor locations. He had photographed the dock's outboard piling, where the depth marker stood, the water line against the post's graduated markings, and had photographed the platform from 2 angles, framing the pontoon tubes against the dock's fixed geometry to establish a visual record of the freeboard change. He had driven home and had transferred the entry to the maintenance log. December 1st, 2025. Week 2, post-closure. Dock marker, 7.5 feet. Drop from closure, 16 inches. Platform freeboard reduction visible from berm. Anchor catenary reduced. Photographs, 7 images. The HOA's community forum had noticed before the third Monday. Dale Pritchard had called Emmett on a Thursday in the second week. Dale's wife had mentioned that the forum posts, which Dale had been following on shared social accounts, had shifted from restaurant event announcements to lake condition observations. Several residents had posted photographs from the lakeside common area showing the waterline's recession, the shoreline grass dry at its margins, the dock's outboard section sitting lower relative to the shore connection, the platform's anchor lines at a shallower angle. One post had included a photograph of the dock marker, 7.6 feet, the post's graduated markings clearly visible, the resident's caption reading, "Is the lake lower than normal? This marker has never been this low in 16 years here. Anyone know what's going on?" Diane had responded to the post. "The board is aware of the water level and is investigating. We want to assure residents that the Harborview Lake has always been a stable feature of our community, and we are committed to addressing any changes in its condition. More information to follow." Dale had read Emmett the post over the phone. Emmett had said, "She doesn't know what's causing it yet." Dale had said, "Does she know about you?" Emmett had said, "She knows about the demand letter. She doesn't know about the valve yet." Or, "She doesn't know that closing the valve is what's dropping the lake." Dale had said, "When will she figure it out?" Emmett had said, "When Aldous tells her to look at the drainage pipe's inlet." The third Monday, the marker was at 6.9 feet, 26 inches of total drop from closure. The platform's pontoons were visibly lower, not dramatically, not to a casual observer on the shore, but clearly to the binoculars from the berm, the pontoon tubes sitting measurably closer to the lake surface than they had at opening day. The freeboard reduced by the full 26 inches of water the lake had lost. The platform was still floating, still anchored, still operational. The restaurant had continued to operate through the 3 weeks of drawdown, the reduced lake depth not yet affecting the pontoon draft's safety margin. The minimum operational depth was 6 feet. The current depth at the dock marker's location was 6.9 feet. One additional week of drawdown at 8 inches per week would put the dock marker at 6.1 feet. 2 additional weeks would put it at 5.3, below the pontoon's minimum draft, the platform grounding on the lake bed, the restaurant's operation ending. He had photographed the marker and the platform and the anchor lines, and had driven home and had written the maintenance log entry, December 8, 2025. Week 3 post-closure. Dock marker, 6.9 feet. Drop from closure, 26 inches. Platform pontoon freeboard, reduced 26 inches from opening day baseline. Minimum operational depth, 6 feet. Current margin above minimum, 0.9 feet. 1 week to minimum operational threshold at current drawdown rate, and had set the log on the desk. His phone had rung at 4:17 p.m. The number was not in his contacts. He had answered. A woman's voice, controlled. The specific kind that came from someone who was managing an emotion while speaking. "I'm trying to reach Emmett Voss. This is Diane Hollis. I'm the president of the Harborview Estates, HOA. I believe you're my neighbor to the west," he had said. "I know who you are, Ms. Hollis." She had said, "Mr. Voss, our community lake has been dropping for 3 weeks. The dock marker is showing nearly 2 feet of loss. Residents are alarmed. The restaurant's operation is being affected, and I need to understand what's happening. I want to ask you directly, did you do something to our lake?" He had said, "I closed my valve on my water." She had been quiet for a moment. Then, "What valve? What water?" He had said, "There's a 24-inch drainage pipe in the eastern boundary berm between my property and yours. The pipe connects my reservoir to your community lake. For 14 years I've had a gate valve on that pipe's inlet. The valve has been open since I installed it in 2011, which is why your lake has been at 9 feet for 14 years. 3 weeks ago I closed the valve. Your lake is finding its natural equilibrium without my reservoir's water supply." She had said, "You can't do that. That pipe is under a recorded easement. You don't have the right to cut off our water." He had said, "Ms. Hollis, the recorded instrument you're referring to was filed in November 2008 without my signature. A conveyance without the grantor's signature conveys nothing. There is no valid easement. There is no recorded water supply agreement. There is no water right held by Harborview Estates, HOA. The water in your lake comes from my reservoir, under my senior water permit, state water permit, WR-1968-041, priority date September 12, 1968. I close my valve on my water. I have a valid legal basis for that closure, and a court action in progress that will confirm it. She had said, a court action. You filed a lawsuit. He had said, a water rights enforcement action and a quiet title action. My attorney filed them 3 weeks ago, the morning before I closed the valve. You should have been served through Aldis's office. She had said, and the control in her voice had shifted, the managed quality giving way to something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was the specific register of a person who had built something and was watching it become something else. Mr. Voss, we spent $340,000 on that restaurant. The platform is floating on that lake. The residents of this community invested in that amenity. You cannot close a valve and drain our lake and destroy what this community has built. He had said, watch the dock marker, Ms. Hollis. It's at 6.9 feet. Your pontoons need 6 feet. You have less than 2 weeks at the current drawdown rate. She had said, this is not over. He had said, no, it's in the water court and the district court. That's where it gets resolved. He had ended the call and had set the phone on the desk beside the maintenance log. He had opened the log to the current page and had added a line to the day's entry. 4:17 p.m. Call from Diane Hollis, HOA President. Informed of valve closure, pipe history, WR-1968-041, pending court actions. Her response, claims easement valid, demands valve opening. Advised to watch dock marker and pursue resolution through courts. Call duration, approximately 6 minutes. He had initialed the entry. He had looked at the window facing east. The meadow was dry in the December light, the berm visible at the meadow's far edge. The valve on the other side of the berm in its closed position, the gate seated, the pipe static, the lake on the far side of the boundary, finding the level it would find without his water. 1 week to the minimum operational threshold, 2 weeks to the bottom of the pontoon draft. The restaurant's future, measured now in feet and inches, on a post that the HOA had installed themselves. Their own measurement instrument recording the consequence of a defective easement and a $340,000 investment built on water that had never been legally theirs to use. He had closed the log. The valve was closed. The lake was dropping. The court actions were filed. He had 1 week before the margin ran out. Diane had filed the emergency complaint on a Wednesday. Clara had called Emmett that afternoon to tell him. The State Water Resources Board's complaint intake office had notified her as the attorney of record in the pending water court action. The standard procedural notice that ran between the board and the courts when a complaint touched a matter already in litigation. The complaint had been filed under the board's emergency provisions, the section of the State Water Code allowing an aggrieved party to request expedited board review when an ongoing water rights violation was causing imminent harm. Diane had filed it herself, without Aldis, using the board's public complaint form available on the state agency's website. Clara had obtained a copy through the board's public records process within 2 hours of the notification and had called Emmett that evening. She had read him the operative paragraph. Diane was claiming that Emmett's valve closure constituted unlawful interference with an established water use, that the recorded drainage easement confirmed the HOA's right to receive water through the pipe, and that the floating restaurant platform serving 180 households was at risk of grounding within days. She was requesting emergency board action, compelling Emmett to reopen the valve and restore the lake to its pre-closure level, pending resolution of the court proceedings. Clara had said, she filed this herself. Aldis didn't draft it. The language isn't his. She went to the state agency's website and used the public form. Emmett had said, what does the board do with it? She had said, they assign an investigator. The investigator pulls the permit records first, before the site visit, before anything else. Once they pull WR-1968-041 and read the priority date, the complaint's legal theory collapses. The board's jurisdiction is water rights. Emmett's water right is senior to everything in the county by 19 years. the complaint is going to come back dismissed. The question is what the investigator notes along the way. The board had assigned the complaint to Roy Sutter, a senior field investigator with the State Water Resources Board's Western District Office, 21 years with the agency. Clara had confirmed his assignment through the board's case management portal the day after the complaint was filed. Sutter's protocol for emergency complaints was 3 steps: pull the permit records, conduct a site inspection, issue a preliminary finding within 15 days. The emergency designation compressed the timeline. He had the permit records pulled within 48 hours. He had called Emmett on a Friday morning. Direct, professional, no preamble. His name, his agency, the complaint number, his request for a site inspection the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. at the eastern boundary berm. Emmett had said, "I'll meet you at the ranch gate at 8:50 and walk you in." He had called Clara immediately after. She had said, "Sutter is competent. I've seen his work on 2 other permit disputes in this district. He reads the permit before he goes to the field, which means he arrives already knowing what WR-1968-041 says. The site visit confirms the physical facts. He's not going to find a violation." Tuesday had been clear and cold, the December light flat and low. Emmett had met Sutter at the ranch gate, a man in his late 40s, field jacket, boots, a clipboard with a printed inspection form, and a copy of the permit certificate clipped to the back. They had shaken hands, and Emmett had driven him to the berm on the ranch track. Sutter had inspected the valve assembly methodically: the concrete collar, the gate frame, the hand wheel in the closed position, the assembly's location on the pipe inlet on Emmett's side of the boundary berm. He had measured the horizontal distance from the valve to the property boundary markers. Emmett had set fresh flagging on the boundary pins that morning, and had recorded the figure on his inspection form. 11 feet west of the property boundary, on Emmett's parcel, outside the easement corridor the drainage easement instrument described. He had looked at the pipe's downstream outlet from the berm's eastern edge, the 24-inch opening on the berm's east face, static, no flow. The pipe closed at the inlet 11 feet to the west. He had photographed both pipe faces, the valve assembly, the boundary markers, and the staff gauge at the reservoir's outlet structure. 9.4 feet, normal operating pool, the reservoir fully intact. He had said, "Your reservoir is at normal pool. The closure hasn't affected your storage level." Emmett had said, "The valve stops the outflow to the drainage pipe. The reservoir's inflow from the 2 tributaries continues. Normal pool is maintained. The only use affected by the closure is the unauthorized downstream use by the HOA's community lake, which holds no water right under this permit or any other." Sutter had written on his form without looking up. They had walked back to the ranch track, and Sutter had asked 3 questions from his form: the valve installation date, the documentation source, and whether Emmett had given any written or verbal authorization for the HOA's water use during the 14-year period. Emmett had answered, March 14, 2011, the maintenance log entry of that date, and no written authorization, no verbal authorization, no instrument of any kind. Sutter had said, "I reviewed the parcel's deed index as part of my pre-inspection research. I want to ask you about the drainage easement instrument recorded in November 2008. Are you the grantor on that instrument?" Emmett had said, "I am not. The grantor line is blank. I did not sign the instrument and did not authorize its recording." Sutter had written on his form, "Then, that's a title matter, outside the board's jurisdiction, but I'm going to note it in my finding and refer it to the State Title Records Office. A defective instrument in the deed records is something the title office should see," he had said before getting in his agency vehicle. "Based on what I've seen today and what the permit record shows, I don't anticipate a finding that supports the complaint's characterization of your valve closure as unlawful interference. WR-1968-041 is a valid senior appropriation. The valve is on your property at the pipe inlet. Your permitted beneficial uses are unimpaired. A permit holder closing a valve on his own property at his own pipe inlet to manage his senior appropriation is not a water code violation." He had stated it the way a 21-year investigator stated a preliminary conclusion, not as reassurance, but as the factual summary of what the records and the site showed before the formal finding was written. Emmett had stood at the gate and watched the agency vehicle reach the county road and turn north. He had pulled his field notebook and written the inspection summary. Sutter's name, the agency, the 3 questions, the statement about the preliminary finding, the easement referral note. He had transferred it to the maintenance log that evening and called Clara. She had said, and the preliminary finding. He said a permit holder closing a valve on his own property at his own pipe inlet is not a water code violation. He said it the way someone says something they've already written. She had been quiet a moment. Then, the community lake. He had said, I was at the berm this morning before Sutter arrived. The dock marker is at 6.7 feet, 26 inches below the closure baseline. The drawdown is running 10 inches per week. The December wind is pulling more surface evaporation than my summer model assumed. She had said, so the platform is closer to minimum draft than your original timeline. He had said, minimum operational depth is 6 feet. Current depth is 6.7. At 10 inches per week, the marker hits 6 feet in approximately 8 days. Clara had said, the board's finding comes out in 10 days. Diane is going to get the dismissal before the lake hits minimum draft. The 4 board members who voted to reject the demand are going to be looking at a state investigator's name on a dismissal order while the dock marker sits at 6 feet. The preliminary finding had arrived 12 days later, 4 pages on the State Water Resources Board's letterhead, signed by Sutter and countersigned by the district supervisor. The conclusion was in the first paragraph. Complaint number WRB-2025-1847 is dismissed. Review of State Water Permit WR-1968-041 confirms a valid senior appropriation with priority date September 12, 1968, held by Emmett G. Voss, the record owner of the subject parcel. Site inspection confirms that the gate valve referenced in the complaint is located on the permit holder's parcel at the inlet of the drainage pipe, within the permit holder's property boundary, and under the permit holder's exclusive operational control. The permit holder's closure of the gate valve constitutes management of a permitted water resource within the scope of WR-1968-041 and does not constitute unlawful interference with any identified water right. No violation of the State Water Code is found. The second page carried the easement referral. Incidental to this investigation, the Board's Records Division identified instrument number 2008-DR-4471 in the county deed records, purporting to establish a drainage easement on the permit holder's parcel. Review of the instrument reveals an absence of the grantor's signature on the conveyance line. This defect is outside the Board's jurisdictional scope, but is referred to the State Title Records Office for review under standard interagency protocol. The Board takes no position on the instrument's validity. Clara had called Emmett when the finding posted to the Board's public records portal. She had read him both paragraphs. When she finished, she had said, "The state looked at the permit. This is what the state found. I've sent a courtesy copy to Aldous with a cover letter noting that the finding is consistent with our original demand letter's legal position and that the easement referral is now part of the official record." He had said, "What's the lake at?" He had driven to the berm that afternoon, the day the finding posted, a Thursday in late December, the light going early, the meadow cold and still. He had stood at the berm with the binoculars and had found the dock marker in the fading light, 6.1 feet, 32 inches below the closure baseline. The platform's pontoons were riding 14 inches lower than they had ridden on opening night. The freeboard reduced, the pontoon tubes sitting visibly close to the lake's surface in a way that was now apparent without binoculars. The platform's profile against the winter water had changed, the clearance between the pontoon bottom and the lake bed compressing toward the 6-foot minimum that stood between the restaurant and the bottom. He photographed the dock marker in the low light, the HOA's own graduated post showing 6.1 feet with the precision of their own instrument, and drove home and wrote the entry. December 28, 2025. Dock marker, 6.1 feet. Drop from closure, 32 inches. Drawdown rate, 10 inches per week, confirmed. Platform pontoon freeboard, 14 inches below opening day baseline. Margin above minimum operational depth, 0.1 feet. Board finding WRB-2025-1847, issued this date. Complaint dismissed. WR-1968-041 valid. Valve closure lawful. Easement defect referred to Title Records Office. He initialed the entry and closed the log. The state had looked at the permit. The state had found what the permit said. The margin above minimum operational depth was 1/10 of a foot. The restaurant had 8 days. The hearing was set for a Thursday in late February. The water court and district court actions had been consolidated at the judge's direction 6 weeks after filing. The two claims arising from the same operative facts, the same permit, the same drainage pipe, the same defective easement instrument. The consolidation, a procedural efficiency that Clara had anticipated and had prepared for from the beginning. The consolidated case was assigned to Judge Patricia Orwell in the County District Court, sitting in water court jurisdiction for the water rights enforcement claim and in general civil jurisdiction for the quiet title claim. Clara had appeared before Orwell twice in prior water rights matters and had described her to Emmett in a single sentence. She reads the permit before she reads the briefs. The courtroom was small, a county district courtroom. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, a gallery with 6 rows of public seating. Diane was in the gallery with 2 of the board members whose names Clara had identified from the HOA's meeting minutes. Aldous sat at the respondent's table, his water rights specialist, a consultant named Peter Garvey, whom Aldous had retained in December, beside him with a binder of tabbed exhibits. Clara sat at the petitioner's table with Emmett to her left, the maintenance log on the table in front of him, the water permit in the exhibit binder beside it. Judge Orwell had read the briefs. It was apparent from her first question, directed to Clara before the formal presentations began. She had asked about the 1994 Supplemental Beneficial Use Filing, the document that had added recreational impoundment to WR 1968-041's covered uses, and whether the impoundment classification had been in continuous good standing since the filing date. Clara had said, "Yes, Your Honor," uninterrupted. The state's triennial permit review confirms it at every cycle, the most recent review completed in 2024. Orwell had written a note and had said, "Proceed." Clara had presented in the order she had outlined at the conference table 4 months earlier, moving through the record with the economy of an attorney who had built the case from a single founding document and had never needed to reach beyond it. She had opened with the permit. WR-1968-041, the certificate, the priority date, the beneficial use categories, the appropriation chain. She had placed the permit certificate on the document projector and had walked through each field, the permit holder's name matching the parcel owner in the current deed records, the priority date of September 12, 1968, the beneficial use documentation covering stock watering, irrigation, domestic use, and recreational impoundment, the permit's current active status confirmed by the State Water Board's most recent triennial review. She had said, "This permit is the foundation of every fact in this case. The water in the Harborview Estates community lake comes from the reservoir covered by this permit. It has come from that reservoir for 14 years. The permit holder is the man sitting at this table. The priority date is 19 years before the first residential development permit was issued in this county." She had moved to the drainage easement instrument. She had placed instrument number 2008-DR-4471 on the projector. The 2-page document, the legal description, the pipe specification, the signature block. She had directed the judge's attention to the grantor line. Blank. She had said, "A drainage easement is a conveyance. A conveyance requires the grantor's signature. The grantor is the record owner of the burdened parcel. Emmett Voss. His name is printed on the grantor line. His signature is absent." The county recorder accepted this instrument for recording in November 2008 because the recorder performs a ministerial function. It records instruments presented in proper form with the recording fee. It does not verify the grantor's authority or signature. This instrument has been in the county deed records for 17 years, conveying a property right that was never actually granted. The HOA acquired its common area parcel from Castellan Development Group in 2009 via a deed that conveyed whatever Castellan held in the drainage infrastructure. Castellan held a defective instrument and a trespass. The HOA inherited both. She had moved to the maintenance log. She had placed the relevant entries on the projector in sequence: the 2010 discovery entry, the 2011 valve installation entry with the hydraulic calculation in Emmett's hand, the quarterly inspection entries through 2025, the closure entry of November 17, 2025. She had said, Mr. Voss discovered the defective easement recording in 2010. He did not immediately file a quiet title action. He installed a gate valve on the pipe inlet in March 2011, a physical act that is documented in this log with the installation date, the valve specifications, and the hydraulic capacity calculation. A person who intends to abandon or waive a property right does not install a gate valve on the pipe whose use he is waiving. The maintenance log documents continuous, uninterrupted reservation of rights from 2010 through the valve closure in November 2025. 14 years of open valve operation is not ratification. It is not waiver. It is a documented, strategic, voluntary choice by a senior appropriator who understood his rights and waited until the downstream party's investment made the water rights question impossible to defer. She had placed the food service permit application on the projector last, the $340,000 figure from the HOA's own forum post, the platform's dimensions, the pontoon draft specification. She had said, the HOA spent $340,000 on a floating restaurant platform, whose operation requires a minimum lake depth of 6 feet. The lake depth is provided entirely by Mr. Voss's reservoir, through a pipe whose inlet valve Mr. Voss controls. The HOA made this investment without conducting title due diligence on the drainage pipe's legal basis, without confirming the existence of a valid water supply easement, and without obtaining a water right of its own. The court's finding of record will confirm what a basic title search would have revealed in 2024, before the first contractor arrived. The HOA had no legal right to the water its restaurant required to float. Aldis had presented for 40 minutes. His argument ran the 3 tracks Clara had anticipated in November: the implied easement arising from 14 years of established use, the riparian drainage characterization of the pipe's flow, and the latches and estoppel argument based on Emmett's 14-year silence. Garvey had testified briefly on the implied easement theory, citing 2 out-of-state cases in which long-term water use had been found to establish an implied supply right. Clara had cross-examined on both cases. Neither involved a prior appropriation state. Neither involved a senior permit holder who had installed a documented control mechanism during the use period, and neither had been followed by courts in this state's water jurisdiction. Judge Orwell had asked one question during Aldis's presentation. She had waited until he had completed the implied easement argument, had looked at her notes, and had said, Mr. Aldis, does the Harborview Estates HOA hold any recorded water right for the community lake? Any water right of any kind, in any category, recorded with the State Water Resources Board or any other authority? Aldis had said, Your Honor, the HOA's position is that the drainage easement instrument, read in conjunction with the established use period, constitutes a functional equivalent of a water supply right that, Orwell had said, I asked whether the HOA holds a recorded water right, yes or no. Aldis had said, No, Your Honor. Orwell had written a note. She had said, Thank you, continue. He had continued, but the latches and estoppel argument that followed had the quality of advocacy proceeding after its conclusion had already been reached by its audience. Clara had rebutted in 12 minutes. The prior appropriation doctrine's foreclosure of prescriptive water rights in this state, the valve installation as the dispositive act defeating the estoppel claim, the inapplicability of riparian doctrine in an appropriation jurisdiction. She had sat down. Orwell had issued her ruling from the bench. She had begun with the permit, WR-1968-041, was a valid senior appropriation, priority date September 12, 1968, covering the beneficial use of the reservoir and its tributary streams, held in good standing by the record owner of the subject parcel. No subsequent water right established in the county held priority over it. She had moved to the easement instrument. Instrument number 2008-DR-4471 was void for failure of execution. The grantor's signature was absent from the conveyance line. No valid drainage easement had been conveyed by the instrument. The HOA held no easement right in the drainage pipe or the water flowing through it. The instrument was ordered stricken from the county deed records, and the county recorder was directed to note the court's quiet title order in the deed index at the instrument's recording number. She had addressed the HOA's defenses in 3 sentences. The implied easement theory failed because an unenforceable instrument could not serve as the basis for an implied right, and because the permit holder's valve installation in 2011 was inconsistent with ratification of the use. The riparian drainage argument failed because this state applied the prior appropriation doctrine, not the riparian doctrine, and the water flowing through the pipe was permitted reservoir outflow, not natural drainage. And the laches and equitable estoppel defenses failed because the permit holder had taken a documented physical action during the use period, the 2011 valve installation, that preserved his rights and precluded a finding of acquiescence or abandonment. She had then issued the order. The HOA was directed to negotiate a recorded water supply easement with Emmett Voss within 90 days of the order's date, the easement to be recorded in the county deed records, and to reflect fair compensation for the 14-year unauthorized use period and the ongoing supply right. If no recorded easement was executed and filed within 90 days, the HOA was ordered to remove the floating restaurant platform from the community lake at the HOA's sole expense within an additional 30 days. The valve's closure was confirmed as a lawful exercise of WR 1968-041 rights. No order compelling Emmett to reopen the valve was issued. She had said, "The court finds that the HOA made a $340,000 capital investment in a structure dependent on a water supply whose legal basis it had not confirmed. The court further finds that a title search conducted before that investment would have revealed the drainage easement's defective recording, the absence of any HOA water right, and the existence of a senior appropriation permit held by the adjacent parcel owner. The remedy available to the HOA at that point, a negotiated water supply easement, remains available now. The court strongly encourages the parties to reach that agreement within the 90-day window." She had gathered her notes and had left the bench. The courtroom had been quiet for a moment. Diane had been in the 3rd row of the gallery. Emmett had not looked at her during the presentation, had looked at her once during Aldis's argument, had noted the specific stillness of a person absorbing a proceeding whose direction has become apparent and whose conclusion is no longer in doubt. He had not looked at her when Orwell left the bench. He had looked at the maintenance log on the table in front of him, the current volume, the entry for November 17th, 2025 somewhere in its middle pages, the closure entry with the time and the valve position and the reservoir level and the downstream lake depth at closure. He had closed the cover and had set his hand on it for a moment. Clara had gathered her exhibits and had said quietly, 90 days. The negotiation starts when they call. He had said, they'll call before Diane's resignation letter goes out. Clara had looked at him. He had said, whoever voted won in the 4-1. They're the next board president. They've been waiting since November. He had picked up the maintenance log and had followed her out of the courtroom into the February light, the hearing behind him, the easement negotiation ahead, the valve closed and the lake at its winter level, and the court order in the record where the defective easement instrument had been for 17 years, occupying the same deed index, telling the truth this time. Diane's resignation letter went to the community forum on a Monday, 7 days after the judgment, 1 paragraph, effective immediately, personal reasons, 4 years of service acknowledged. She did not mention the hearing. She did not mention the order. She did not mention the dock marker, or the valve, or the easement, or the $340,000. The forum thread that followed her post ran 200 replies before the new interim board president closed comments and pinned a statement at the top. The board is focused on resolving the water supply matter and will provide an update to residents within the week. The interim board president was a unit owner named Gerald Foss, the one in the 4-1 vote, whose dissent the November meeting minutes had recorded without elaboration. He had called Clara's office on a Wednesday morning, 2 days after Diane's resignation, and had asked to speak with Emmett directly. Clara had conferred the call. He had said, "Mr. Voss, I want to resolve this correctly and quickly. What does a negotiated easement look like from your side?" Emmett had said, fair compensation for 14 years of unauthorized beneficial use of a senior water right, and a recorded easement instrument that correctly documents the supply right going forward. The instrument that should have been in the county deed records in 2008. Gerald had said, the $118,000 figure from the original demand letter. Emmett had said, the court's order confirmed the unauthorized use period and the permit's validity. The figure is the figure. Gerald had said, I'll bring it to the board this week. The board had voted 3 days later, 4-0, 1 abstention. The abstention recorded without explanation. The HOA authorized the easement negotiation at the demand letter's compensation figure and directed Gerald to execute the recorded instrument within the court's 90-day window. Clara and the HOA's new property counsel, Aldous had not been retained for the negotiation, had drafted the easement instrument in 2 weeks, a permanent recorded water supply easement appurtenant to the Harborview Estates common area parcel, granting non-exclusive rights to water supply from Emmett's reservoir through the eastern boundary drainage pipe, the compensation figure reflecting the 14-year unauthorized use and the ongoing supply right, a recorded maintenance agreement attached, covering the pipe's ongoing upkeep on a cost-shared basis. The HOA had wired the compensation to Clara's trust account on the instrument's execution date. Clara had dispersed it to Emmett the same afternoon. The easement had recorded in the county deed records 3 days later, the instrument appearing in both parcel records, Emmett's and the HOA's. The supply right finally documented in the county deed records 18 years after the drainage pipe had been installed, and 17 years after a defective instrument had failed to document it. Emmett had opened the valve the morning after the easement recorded. He had driven to the berm at first light, the March air cold and still, the meadow showing the first pale green of the early grass at the berm's base, the reservoir at its winter pool behind him, the 2 tributary streams running at their spring volume. He had walked to the valve assembly and had set the torque wrench on the hand wheel and had turned it counterclockwise. 22 rotations, full close to full open, the gate retracting from the pipe inlet in the same mechanical sequence it had advanced through on November 17th, the flow returning to the pipe as the gate cleared the inlet, the sound of the water moving through the 24-inch opening returning after 112 days of silence, the reservoir water finding the pipe and the pipe finding its grade, and the water moving east through the boundary berm toward the community lake the way it had moved for 14 years. Now with a recorded instrument in the county deed records saying what it always should have said. He had taken 1 photograph, the valve in full open position, the hand wheel horizontal, the reservoir surface visible in the background. He had written the field notebook entry and had driven home and had transferred it to the maintenance log at the kitchen desk. March 19, 2026, valve opened, 22 rotations full close to full open, gate clear, flow restored. Reservoir level, 9.1 feet. Easement number 2026-WS-0041, recorded March 18, 2026, in county deed records, both parcel indices. Compensation paid and dispersed. Maintenance agreement recorded concurrent with easement. He had looked at the entry for a moment. Then he had written the final line. Easement recorded. Valve open. Water rights confirmed. Matter recorded. He had initialed it and closed the log. The lake had returned to its operating level in 3 weeks, the reservoir's daily outflow refilling the community lake's lost volume at 174,000 gallons per day. The dock marker climbing back through its graduated markings in the reverse of the sequence Emmett had photographed through December and January. The pontoons rising with the water, the platform returning to its opening day draft in the 3rd week of April. The restaurant had reopened on a Saturday, string lights on the lake again, residents at the 60-cover dining tables on the platform, the dock lit, the lake at 9 feet on the HOA's own marker post. Emmett had walked to the reservoir's outlet structure the morning after the easement recorded, the morning before he opened the valve. The last morning, the water moved east without a recorded instrument behind it. He had stood at the outlet structure his father had built in 1971 and had looked at the reservoir. 22 acres of still water in the early March light, the 2 tributary streams audible at the confluence in the eastern basin, the East Fork and the West Fork, meeting where they had always met, the water surface holding at 9 feet on the staff gauge his father had calibrated to mean sea level in 1973. His family had held this water since 1968. His father had understood before driving the first fence post that the water was the thing you documented before you documented anything else. The senior appropriation had predated every residential development in the county. It had outlasted the developer, who had installed a pipe without permission, the defective easement that had sat in the deed records for 17 years conveying nothing, the $340,000 restaurant that had been built on water, whose legal basis had never been established, the emergency complaint that a state investigator had dismissed in 12 days, the 4-to-1 board vote that had made the court action necessary. The water had been moving in the same direction for a very long time. He went inside.